Have you ever shared something true about yourself, something honest, something real, and walked away feeling strangely lighter, only to notice, weeks or months later, that something had quietly shifted? Not in a dramatic way, no confrontation, no betrayal you could name, just a subtle change in how people held you. A faint sense that the room had already decided who you were, that your next move had somehow already been predicted. Do you ever wonder whether all the honesty you offered actually brought you closer to anyone, or whether it simply made you easier to dismiss? Most of us were taught that openness is how trust is built, that the more of yourself you give, the more real the connection becomes. And so we share, we explain ourselves, we offer the interior before anyone has asked for it. But there is a question worth sitting with, not whether honesty matters, it does, but whether the version of openness most of us practice is actually honesty at all, or whether it is something quieter and more complicated than that. She had always been the open one in the office. Not in a loud way, not in the way that makes people uncomfortable. She was simply honest. When she had concerns about a project, she said so. When she was overwhelmed, she mentioned it. When she disagreed with a decision her manager made, she said that too, carefully, with good intentions. She believed this was what a healthy work environment looked like. Directness, authenticity, not playing games. For a while, it seemed to work. Her colleagues appreciated her honesty. Her manager praised her for being forthright. She felt like herself at work, which is something most people never manage. But over the course of a year, something began to shift. She noticed that she was no longer being included in certain conversations. Decisions were being made before meetings rather than during them. When she walked into a room, the energy changed in a way that was difficult to describe. Not hostile, just different, careful. She brought up a new idea during a team meeting, and the silence that followed was just a second too long. She could not point to a specific moment when things changed. There was no conflict, no confrontation, no clear cause. But she began to sense slowly that people had formed a picture of her. Not a bad picture exactly, but a complete one, a fixed one. A picture they referred to instead of actually seeing her. She had been so transparent for so long that she had stopped being a person to them. She had become a pattern. What she felt was not betrayal, it was closer to confusion. She had done what she believed was right. She had shown up genuinely. She had said what she meant. She had not manipulated anyone or played a role. And yet here she was, feeling like someone who had handed over something valuable without knowing the full terms of the exchange. The openness had felt like strength at the time. It had felt like confidence, like she had nothing to hide and that this was something to be proud of. There had even been a kind of relief in it, the relief of not having to manage herself carefully, of not having to wonder what was appropriate to say or when. She had simply spoken. She had simply been there. But now it felt different. Now it felt less like freedom and more like exposure. She thought about specific moments. The time she told a colleague she was nervous before a big presentation. The time she admitted to her manager that she was not sure she wanted to keep moving toward a leadership role. The time she shared in a casual lunch conversation that she sometimes felt underused. The time she mentioned offhand that she had been passed over for something years ago at a previous job and had never quite stopped thinking about it. Each of those moments had felt honest and right at the time. Each of them had been received with warmth and sometimes with gratitude, as if the other person had been waiting for exactly that kind of openness. But each of them had also lodged somewhere, Each of them had become part of a picture she had not meant to hand over all at once, not because each piece was damaging on its own, but because together they formed something that was now being used in place of actually seeing her. What bothered her most was not that people had used her honesty against her. They had not exactly. It was that they had used it to file her away, to decide who she was before she had finished becoming it. Every candid moment she had offered had become a data point. Every admission had been quietly catalogued. And now, even when she changed her mind about something or grew past an old opinion, the room did not seem to notice. They already knew her, or thought they did. She had not lost their respect. She had lost something harder to name, something closer to their curiosity. And without that, without the small open space where a person is still slightly unknown, even warmth begins to feel like a ceiling. This is not an unusual story. Most people who value authenticity have lived some version of it. They offer themselves honestly and generously, and at some point they realize that the offering has costs they did not anticipate. Not dramatic costs, not ruptures or betrayals, just a gradual dimming, a subtle change in the quality of how they are held in other people's awareness. It is not that honesty itself is the problem. It is something more specific than that. It is about what happens when the people around you feel they have finished learning who you are. When the mystery is gone, not because you became mysterious, but simply because you gave everything away too quickly, too completely, in too steady a stream. There is something about being known too well, too soon, that quietly changes the way others relate to you. Not because they like you less, but because the relationship loses something it needs in order to stay alive. People engage most fully with what they cannot entirely predict. They pay attention to what is still open. They lean toward what has not yet been fully explained. This is not a flaw in how people operate. It is simply how attention works. It moves toward what is not yet resolved. When someone becomes entirely readable, even people who care for them begin to stop paying close attention. The story they feel has been told. What else is there to discover? And so the relationship does not end. It does not sour. It simply settles into something like furniture, familiar, taken for granted, present without being seen. The troubling part is that the person who gave themselves away often does not recognize this as the cause. They feel the flatness without understanding it. They begin to wonder if the problem is them. They try harder. They share more. And in doing so, they only deepen the very dynamic they are trying to escape. This can happen in workplaces the way it happened with her, but it happens in friendships too, in long partnerships, in family relationships, in any place where one person has handed over so much of themselves so consistently that the other has stopped looking, has stopped wondering, has stopped asking. The person who gave everything away often does not understand at first what has shifted. They feel vaguely unseen without knowing why. They feel like they are performing for a room that has already heard this particular story, and in a way they have. They told it themselves, one small piece at a time, over and over, until there was nothing left that felt new. And this is the pattern worth noticing, not cruelty, not betrayal, just the quiet, consistent cost of having no interior space that belongs only to you. Machiavelli was not a cynical man by nature. He was an observational one. He spent years watching how power actually moved through people and institutions, not how it was supposed to move, not how the idealists described it, but how it actually functioned in practice. And what he noticed again and again was the gap between what was visible and what was real. between the self a person presented and the self they protected, between what was said in rooms and what was decided before anyone arrived. He understood that in any social world, a court, a city, an office, a household, perception functions as a kind of currency. It is not only what you are that determines how you are treated, it is what others believe you to be. And crucially, they can only believe what you have allowed them to see. This insight has been simplified over the centuries into something it was never meant to be. It gets reduced to manipulation, to deception, to calculated performance. People hear the name Machiavelli and think of cold strategy and ruthless scheming. But that misses the quieter thing he was pointing toward. He was pointing toward restraint as a form of self-possession. Not the performance of mystery, not deliberate withholding as a tactic, but the natural result of a person who understands that they are not required to make themselves entirely legible to everyone around them, that the self is not a document to be submitted, that there is a difference between being present and being transparent. A person who holds something back is not hiding. They are maintaining a space, a private interior that is theirs alone, not because they are protecting it from enemies, but because some things lose their quality when they are put on display too soon or too often. Some thoughts are truest when they remain unspoken. Some experiences mean more when they are not converted into a story for someone else's consumption. Machiavelli observed that the figures who commanded lasting respect in politics, in negotiation, in the social world, were rarely the ones who explained themselves most thoroughly. They were not the ones who rushed to clarify their intentions or offer their vulnerabilities as proof of honesty. They were the ones who remained, in some essential way, slightly unfinished, slightly open-ended, who could not be fully anticipated. And because of this, they continued to occupy a certain live space in the imagination of those around them. People continued to wonder about them, continued to pay attention, continued to extend a kind of active consideration that they withheld from those they felt they had already understood. This is not about being cold. It is not about being withholding in a way that damages closeness. It is about understanding that the quality of a relationship depends partly on the sense that the other person still has interior territory you have not yet mapped. What she had done without meaning to was collapse that territory. She had made herself entirely knowable, and in doing so she had taken herself out of other people's imagination entirely. They no longer wondered about her. They already knew what she would think, what she would feel, how she would respond. And so they had stopped paying the kind of attention that makes a person feel real to another. This pattern is wider than any single workplace, wider than any single relationship. There is a cultural pressure, especially now, to be fully open, to share widely and without reservation, to treat privacy as a kind of hoarding and vulnerability as the highest form of courage. And there is genuine truth in some of that. The willingness to be known, truly known, in moments that matter, is one of the things that makes relationships feel worth having. But the culture has confused that truth with something else entirely. It has begun to treat all disclosure as valuable, all sharing as healthy, all openness as brave, and in doing so, it has quietly removed the distinction between the intimacy that deepens connection and the constant self-exposure that slowly drains it. There is a difference between intimacy and inventory, between being known and being cataloged. Real closeness does not require the complete transfer of every thought, every fear, every opinion. In fact, some of the deepest relationships in a person's life are built not around full disclosure, but around a mutual recognition of depth. around the sense that the other person continues to contain something you have not yet reached, that there is more of them than you have seen, that the relationship, however long it has lasted, is still open, still alive, still capable of surprising you. The self that is always on display is not necessarily the truest self. It may just be the most exhausted one. The one that has stopped editing, stopped selecting, stopped understanding that not everything belongs in every room. The one that has confused the relief of saying something aloud with the value of having said it. There's a certain quality that some people carry, a kind of settled composure that others find compelling without always knowing why. It is not coldness, it is not emotional unavailability, it is simply the presence of an interior that has not been fully given away. A person who still has something in reserve, who does not need the room to understand them completely in order to feel at ease in it, who can sit in silence without filling it, who can be asked a question and take a moment before answering, not because they are calculating, but because they actually live inside themselves. That quality is not performed. It cannot be faked without eventually feeling hollow, but it can be understood, and once understood, it can be chosen not as strategy, not as a game, but as a form of genuine self-respect. As a recognition that not every part of you was made for public consumption, that your interior life is yours, that keeping it does not make you closed, it makes you whole. There is also something worth noticing about how the people who share the least often seem to occupy the most space, not because they are louder or more dominant, but because they leave room for something, a question, a wonder, a sense that you are still only at the beginning of understanding them, and that beginning is where attention actually lives. She did not change dramatically after she understood this. She did not reinvent herself. She did not become a different kind of person in the office, cooler or more strategic or deliberately hard to read. That would have been its own kind of performance, and she had no interest in that. She did not become closed or cold. She did not stop being honest. She still said what she meant when it mattered. She still pushed back when something seemed wrong. She still showed up as herself, but she began to think, perhaps for the first time, about what showing up as herself actually meant. She began to make different decisions about what belonged where, about which thoughts required an audience and which ones were simply hers to sit with, about the difference between sharing something because it was useful and sharing something because the silence had become uncomfortable, about what she was actually seeking when she explained herself before anyone had asked for an explanation. She began to notice how much of what she had given away over the years had not actually deepened anything. It had not created the closeness she had been reaching for. It had only made certain relationships feel less spacious, less alive, like rooms with no corners left to explore, no shadows worth looking into, no door that had not already been opened. Holding something back turned out to feel less like guarding and more like breathing. Not everything needed to be said, not because it was shameful or dangerous, but because it was hers. Because privacy is not the same thing as secrecy. Because a person can be warm and fully present and genuinely real without becoming entirely transparent. Those are not the same thing. They never were. She began to understand that a great deal of what she had called openness had actually been something else. It had been a quiet, continuous attempt to manage how she was perceived, to get ahead of any misreading, to offer so much context, so much explanation, so much interior access that no one could ever form a picture of her that was wrong. But the picture they had formed was not wrong. It was just finished. And finished pictures do not move. There is a version of openness that comes from fear, from the belief that if people see everything, they cannot be surprised, cannot be disappointed, cannot leave. This version gives everything away and calls it trust. But what it actually is underneath is an attempt to eliminate uncertainty, to make yourself so fully known that no one can ever misunderstand you. And the cost of that attempt is the very aliveness it was trying to protect. And there is a version of restraint that comes from something steadier, from knowing yourself well enough to understand that you do not need to be fully legible to everyone in every room, that what you keep quietly inside you is not something you are hiding from others. It is something you are keeping for yourself, not out of fear, but out of a simple, grounded recognition that some things are yours and that keeping them does not make you less honest. It makes you more complete. Life does become easier when people know less about you. Not because you are hiding, but because you finally understand the difference between what belongs to the room and what belongs only to you. Most of us were taught that openness is generosity, that to share is to connect, that withholding is a form of distance. And there is truth in that. There is real warmth in the willingness to be known. But there is also something that openness, taken too far, quietly removes. A kind of interior space. A private life of the mind that sustains you in ways that have nothing to do with whether anyone else knows it exists. The people who move through the world with ease are rarely the ones who have explained themselves most thoroughly. They are the ones who have learned, without becoming cold, to keep something quietly in reserve, not as strategy, not as defense, but as a simple act of self-possession. You do not owe anyone the complete version of yourself. You are allowed to be more than what is visible. And perhaps the deepest form of confidence is not saying everything you know, but knowing that you could, and choosing not to.